lightning and the wind began to blow. There's thousands of people ain't got no place to go. Backwater blues done caused me to pack my things and go. Backwater blues done caused me to pack my things and go. 'Cause my house fell down and I can't live there no more.
Bessie Smith, of course, the Empress of the Blues, singing of a disaster, of a flood. Sitting with me, hearing Bessie Smith on this recording, is James Baldwin, brilliant young American writer, but perhaps a more specific description of Mr. Baldwin, since he is one of the rare men in the world who seems to know who he is today. James Baldwin, brilliant young Negro American writer. And as you listen to this, Jim, to this record of Bessie Smith, what's your feeling?
It's very hard to describe that feeling. The first time I ever heard this record was in Europe, and under very different circumstances than I'd ever listened to Bessie in New York. And what struck me was the fact that she was singing, as you say, about a disaster, which had almost killed her, and she'd accepted it and was going beyond it. It's a fantastic kind of understatement in it. It's the way I want to write. You know, when she says, "My house fell down and I can't live there no more," it's a great sentence. It's a great achievement.
The way you want to write, you say.
Yeah.
I'm looking now at page 5 of your new book, and it's a remarkable one. Nobody Knows My Name. It's a series of essays, articles, opinions of James Baldwin, more notes of a native son, the subtitle. And on page 5, the reason I've chosen the Bessie Smith record, because on page 5 you write of your being in Europe. You're in Switzerland.
Yes.
And you said you came armed with 2 Bessie Smith records and a typewriter. And I began to try to recreate the life that I had first known as a child, from which I'd spent so many years in flight. And it was Bessie Smith who, through her tone and her cadence, helped me dig back to the way I myself must have spoken when I was little. And I remember the things I had heard and seen and felt. I buried them deep. And here's the part, I had never listened to Bessie Smith in America. In the same way for years I never touched watermelon. But in Europe, I should reconcile myself.
Yes, well, how can I put that? That winter in Switzerland, I was working on my first novel, which I thought I would never be able to finish. And I finally realized in Europe that one of the reasons that I couldn't finish this novel was because I was ashamed of where I'd come from and where I'd been, and ashamed of the life in the church, and ashamed of my father, ashamed of the blues, and ashamed of jazz, and of course ashamed of watermelon, because it was, all of these stereotypes that the country inflicts on Negroes, that we all eat watermelon, or we all do nothing but sing the blues and all that. Well, I was afraid of all that, and I ran from it. And when I say I was trying to dig back to the way I myself must have spoken when I was little, I realized that I had acquired so many affectations, I had told myself so many lies, that I really had buried myself beneath a whole fantastic image of myself which wasn't mine, but white people's image of me. And I realized that I had not always talked, obviously I hadn't always talked the way I had forced myself to learn how to talk. And I had to find out what I had been like in the beginning. In order, just technically then, to recreate Negro speech, I realized it was a cadence, it was a beat, much more than, it was not a question of dropping S's or N's or G's, but a question of the beat, really. And Bessie had the beat. And in that, this icy wilderness, as far removed from Harlem as anything you can imagine, with Bessie Smith and me, and white snow, and white mountains, and white faces, who really thought I'd been sent by the devil. It was very strange. They'd never seen a Negro before. And in this kind of isolation, it's very hard to describe, I managed to finish the book. And I played Bessie every day. And really, literally, this may sound strange. A lot of the book is in dialogue, and I corrected things according to what I was able to hear when Bessie sang and when James B. Johnson plays. It's that tone and that sound, which is in me.
This is in a forthcoming novel.
This is in a forthcoming novel. Yes.
The point you made a moment ago, the point you were speaking of, the sense of shame. Did you sense this, the sense of shame of a heritage that is so rich in accepting the white man's stereotype of yourself?
I'm afraid it's one of the great dilemmas, one of the great psychological hazards of being an American Negro. And in fact, it's much more than that. I've seen a great many people go under. And every Negro in America is, some way, one way or another, menaced by it. One's born in a white country, in a white Protestant Puritan country, where one was once a slave, where all the standards and all the images that when you open your eyes in the world, everything you see, none of it applies to you. You go to white movies and like everybody else, you fall in love with Joan Crawford, and you root for the good guys who are killing off the Indians. And it comes as a great psychological collision when you begin to realize that all of these things are really metaphors for your oppression and will lead into a kind of psychological warfare in which you may perish. I was born in a church, for example, and my father was a very rigid and righteous man. But of course we were in Harlem. We lived in a terrible house. And downstairs from us there were, all these, what my father called good time people. There was a prostitute and all of her paramours and all that jazz. I remember I loved this woman. She was very nice to us. But we weren't allowed to go to her house, and whenever we went there, we were beaten for it. And when I was older, that whole odor of gin, homemade gin, really, and pig's feet and chitterlings and poverty and the basement, all this got terribly mixed up together in my mind with the whole holy roller white god business. And I really began to go a little out of my mind because I obviously wasn't white. It wasn't even a question so much of wanting to be white, but I didn't quite know anymore what being black meant. I couldn't accept what I'd been told, and all you've ever told in this country about being black is that it's a terrible, terrible thing to be. Now, in order to survive this, you have to really dig down into yourself and recreate yourself according to no image which yet exists in America. You have to impose, in fact, this may sound very strange, you have to decide who you are, and force the world to deal with you and not this idea of you.
You have to decide who you are, whether you are black or white.
Who you are. And then I must say, at this point, at that pressure, the question of being black or white is robbed of its power. I mean, you can still, of course, be beaten up on the South Side by anybody, I mean, the social menace does not lessen. But in some way, it is a world now which perhaps can destroy you physically. But the danger of your destroying yourself has not vanished, but is minimized.
The name of the book, if we may, this is directly connected. Nobody Knows My Name. For years, you, and I see a big of you, known as James, never known as James Baldwin, like Home James, sometimes called George, in the old days Sam, or
Boy.
Sometimes Boy.
Sometimes.
Nobody Knows My Name. Why did you choose that title?
Well, at the risk of sounding pontifical, it's at once, I suppose, a fairly bitter title, but it's also meant as a kind of warning to my country. In the days when people call me boy, those days haven't passed, except that I didn't answer then, and I don't answer now. To be a Negro in this country is really just, as Ralph Ellison has said it very well, really never to be looked at. And what white people see when they look at you is not
invisible.
You. You're invisible. What they do see when they look at you is what they've invested you with. And what they've invested you with is all the agony and the pain and the danger and the passion and the torment, the sin, death, and hell of which everyone in this country is terrified. You represent a level of experience which Americans deny. And I think, this may sound mystical, but I think it's very easily proven. It's proven in great relief in the South when you consider the extraordinary price, the absolutely prohibitive price the South has paid to keep the Negro in his place, and have not succeeded in doing that, but has succeeded in having what is almost certainly the most bewildered and demoralized white population in the Western world. And on another level, you can see in the life of the country, not only in the South, what a terrible price the country has paid for this effort to keep a distance between themselves and black people. It was, in the same way, for example, that it is very difficult, it is hazardous, psychologically, personally hazardous for a Negro in this country really to hate white people because he is too involved with them, not only socially, but historically, and no matter who says what, In fact, Negroes and whites in this country are related to each other. Half of the black families in the South are related to, the judges and the lawyers and the white families of the South. They're cousins and kissing cousins at least kissing cousins. Now, this is a terrible depth of involvement. It's easy for an African to hate the invader and drive him out of Africa. But it is very difficult for an American Negro to do this obviously cannot do this with white people. There's no place to drive them. This is a country which belongs equally to us both. And one's got to learn to live together here, or else there won't be any country.
This matter of living together, or this ambivalent attitude that the South has toward the Negro, and the ambivalence perhaps is most eloquently, perhaps tragically expressed in the sayings of William Faulkner, the brilliant American novelist who writes a remarkable story, Dry September, in which seems to analyze the malaise. At the same time, he himself makes comments that are shocking. You have a chapter in your book dealing with Faulkner and desegregation. And is it this ambivalence, too, that
it's this love, hatred. I hate to think of what the spiritual state of the South would be if all the Negroes moved out of it. The white people there don't want them, want to keep them there, want them in their place, but would be terrified if they left. I really think the bottom of their world would have fallen out. In the case of Faulkner, in Dry September or Light in August, or even in The Sound of the Fury, he can really get at, as you put it, to the bone. He can get at the truth of what the black-white relation is in the South and what a dark force it is in the Southern personality. But at the same time, Faulkner as a citizen, as a citizen of Mississippi, is committed to what Mississippians take to be their past. And it's one thing for Faulkner to deal with the Negro in his imagination, where he can control him, and quite another one to deal with him in life, where he can't control him. And in life, obviously, the Negro, the uncontrollable Negro, is determined to overthrow everything in which Faulkner imagines himself to believe. It's one thing to demand justice in literature, and another thing to face the price that one's got to pay for it in life. And I think another thing about the Southerners, and I think it's also true of the nation, is that no matter how they deny it or what kind of rationalizations they cover it up with, they know the crimes they've committed against black people, and they're terrified that these crimes will be committed against them.
The element of guilt then is here too.
Yes.
There's a point you make, and very beautifully, somewhere in the book, and Nobody Knows My Name, I forget which one of the essays involved. In the South, the white man is continuously bringing up the matter of the Negro. In the North, never. So obsessed in one case and so ignored
in another.
In the other.
It's very funny. It's very funny, especially because the results turn out to be in the case of the Negroes a lot in the world, so very much the same. But it seems to me that it must be absolute torment to be a Southerner. If you imagine that these people, that one day, one day even Faulkner himself was born, and certainly, when he was born, he was raised by a black woman, probably the model for Dilsey, and one fine day, a child of 3 or 4 or 5 who has been involved with black people on the most intense level, and at the most important time in anybody's life, it suddenly breaks on him like a thundercloud that it's all taboo. And of course, since we know that nobody ever recovers really, from his earliest impressions, the torment that goes on in a Southerner who is absolutely forbidden to excavate his beginnings, it seems to me is the key to those terrifying mobs. It isn't hatred that drives those people in the streets, it's pure terror.
And perhaps a bit of schizophrenia here,
Well,
too.
by this time, it's absolutely schizophrenic.
Yeah.
And I must say, not only in the South, but the South is a very useful example on a personal and social level of what is occurring really in the country. And the sexual paranoia, again, it's very important to remember what it means to be born in a Protestant Puritan country, with all the taboos which are placed on the flesh, and to have, at the same time, in this country, such a vivid example of, at least in the imagination, of paganism and the sexual liberty with which white people invest Negroes and penalize them for.
Combination of Puritanism and paganism, both.
Yes.
And the conflict.
And the terrible tension. The
tensions that come as a result.
It's a guilt about the flesh, and in this country, the Negro pays for that guilt that white people have about the flesh.
Since you bring up this point of the Negro pays for the guilt the white people have about flesh, we think, too, of the relative position of the Negro woman and the Negro man.
My God.
And in this article, you wrote a beautiful article for Tone magazine. You were saying something about the mistress of the house, the white mistress, who admires her maid very much, but he speaks of the no-count husband.
No-count husband.
And so this brings the matter of what it means to be a Negro male.
It connects with that old phrase that Negroes are the last to be hired and the first to be fired. And this does not apply to the Negro maid, particularly, though it can. But it absolutely applies without exception and with great rigor to Negro men. And one's got to consider, especially when one begins to talk about this whole theory, the whole tension between violence and nonviolence, the dilemma and the rage and the anguish of a Negro man who in the first place is forced to accept all kinds of humiliations in his working day, whose power in the world is so slight that he can not really protect his home, his wife, his children, and then finds himself out of work and watches his children growing up menaced in exactly the same way that he has been menaced. When a child is 14, when a Negro child is 14, he knows the score already. There's nothing you can do and all you can do about it is pray, really, that this will not destroy him. But the tension that this creates within the breast of the man is absolutely unimaginable and something this country refuses to imagine, and very, very dangerous. And it complicates the sexuality of the country and of the Negro in a hideous way, exactly because all Negroes are raised in a kind of matriarchy, since after all the wife can go out and wash the white lady's clothes, and steal little things from the kitchen. And this is the way we've all grown up. Now, this creates another social, psychological problem in what we like to refer to as a subculture, which is a part of the bill which the country is going to have to pay. Bills always do come in. Yeah. One's always
bills.
There's
always, as a phrase Sandburg used, slums always seek their revenge.
Yes, they do indeed. Yes, they do indeed.
Thinking about the matriarchal setup of the Negro family, the Negro life, even back to slave days, the Underground Railway leaders, Harriet Tubman, were the women.
Yeah. It's a terrible thing. Negro women for generations have raised white children who sometimes lynched their children, and have tried to raise their raise their child like a man, and yet in the full knowledge that if he really walks around like a man, he's going to be cut down. It's a terrible kind of dilemma. It's a terrible price to ask anybody to pay. And in this country, Negro women have been paying it for 300 years. And for 100 of those years, when they were legally and technically free. When people talk about time, therefore, I can't help but be absolutely not only impatient but bewildered. Why should I wait any longer? And in any case, even if I were willing to, which I'm not, how?
The point you mean about go slow?
Go slow, yes.
Go slow, take it easy. Again, there's a last sentence you have on that, on the Faulkner chapter about how it changed, about whatever approach to humanity, to being human beings, it must be now, the moment you speak
of.
It's
always now.
The world we're living in, we have to make it over. The world we live, we made the world we live, but you speak of now. It's always now.
Time is always now. Everybody, I think everybody who's ever thought about his own life knows this. You don't make resolutions about something you're going to do next year. No. If you decide to write a book, you may write the book may be finished 20 years from now, but you've got to start it now.
I'm thinking of the subtitle of your book now, and the position of the Negro woman, Negro man, Notes of a Native Son. Naturally, I immediately think of Richard Wright, who has meant so much to you as an artist and as a man. And his short story, you refer to this beautifully here in the chapter, Alas, Poor Richard, one of the three chapters on Richard Wright, Man of All Work, in which the husband, to get a job, dresses himself up in his wife's clothes and hires off as a cook.
Yeah. It's a beautiful, terrifying story. And it really gets at something which has been hidden for all these generations, which is the ways in which it really suggests, more forcibly than anything I've ever read, really, the humiliation that a Negro male endures. And it's this which the country doesn't want to know. And therefore, when people talk about the noble savage, and the greater sexuality of Negroes and all that jazz, whereas I know I could name, if we were not on the air, 6 people I know whom I grew up, 6 men who were on the needle, just because the demoralization is so complete that in order to make the act of love, there's got to be a certain confidence, a certain trust. Otherwise, it degenerates into nothing but desperate, and futureless brutality.
You've spoken of the needle now, and we think, of course, of junkies, and we think of narcotics. And here again, perhaps for some, the only means of escape from the brutal reality.
Yes, that's right. That's right. I knew a boy very well once who told me, almost that many words, that he wasn't trying to get high, he was just trying to hold himself together. Because he also said, talking about himself walking through one of our cities, one morning, and the way people looked at him. And he said to himself, he told me that, well, if you ought to be able to bear me if I can bear you. What is most appalling about it is that all of these things might not be so terrible if, when facing well-meaning white people, one didn't realize that they don't know anything about this at all, and don't want to know. And this somehow really is the last drop in a very bitter cup, because if they don't know and don't want to know, then what hope is there? When people talk to me about the strides that have been made and the all these dreary movies Hollywood keeps turning about be kind to Negroes today, and isn't this a good sign? Well, of course, they've never seen these movies with a Negro audience watching them.
What is the reaction?
Well, for example, in The Defiant Ones, a movie which I really cannot say anything.
That's okay. Go ahead. Please do.
At the end of that movie, when Sidney, who was very brilliant in it, and who does his best with a rather dreary role, does something with it which I wouldn't believe could have been done. Anyway, at the end of that movie, when Sidney jumps off the train to rescue Tony Curtis, downtown, I saw it twice deliberately. I saw it downtown and for a white liberal audience, I suppose they were liberal. There was a great sigh of relief and clapping, and I felt that this was a very noble gesture on the part of a very noble black man, when I suppose in a way it was. And I saw it uptown, and then he jumps off the train, and there's a tremendous roar of fury from the audience, with which I must say I agreed. They told Sidney to get back on the train, you fool. And in any case, why in the world would he go back to the chain gang where they're obviously going to be separated again? It's still a Jim Crow chain gang. What's the movie supposed to prove? And what the movie is designed to prove, really, to white people, is that Negroes are going to forgive them for their crimes, and that somehow they're going to escape scot-free. Now, I myself am not, I am not being vengeful when I say this at all, because I would hate to see the nightmare begin all over again with shoes on the other foot. But I'm talking about a human fact, and the human fact is this: that one can't escape anything one's done. One's got to pay for it, and you either pay for it willingly or you pay for it unwillingly.
As you say this, and I was thinking of the Negro audience, and I get back on the train, you fool. We think of two movements happening simultaneously with the Negro in America today: the Black Muslim movement and Martin Luther King.
Yes.
And here it seems to be directly connected, doesn't it?
Yes, precisely. And I must admit, that there is a great ambivalence in myself about. For example, I'm devoted to King, and I work with Call, and try to help raise money for the Freedom Riders, and I adore those children. I have tremendous respect for them. And yet, at the same time, and talking to very different people, and somewhat older, and also talking to ex-sit-in students who said, no, I simply can't take it anymore. I don't know. Let me put it another way. King's influence in the South is tremendous, but his influence in the North is slight. And the North loves to talk about the South. Chicago wants to talk about Mississippi, and so they had no South Side. And, and white people in New York talk about Alabama, and so they had no Harlem. And it's a great device on the part of white people to ignore what's happening in their own backyard. Now, whether, let us say, I were for or against violence, this is absolutely irrelevant. The question which really obsesses me today is that whether or not I like it, and whether or not you like it, unless the situation is ameliorated, and very, very quickly, there will be violence. There will be violence. I'm as convinced of this as I am that I'm sitting in this chair one day in Birmingham. And it won't be the fault of the Negroes in Birmingham. It's the fault of the administration of Birmingham and the apathy of Washington. It is an intolerable situation. It has been intolerable for 100 years. I really cannot tell my nephew or my brother. My nephew is 14. My brother's a grown man. I can't really tell my nephew that if someone hits him, he shouldn't hit back. I really cannot tell him that. And still less can I tell my brother that if someone comes to his house with a gun, that he should let him in, and allow him to do what he wants with his children and his wife. But the point is, even if I were able to tell my brother that he should, there's absolutely no guarantee that my brother will, and I can't blame him. It's too easy in another way for the country to sit in admiration before the sit-in students, because it doesn't cost them anything They have no idea what it costs those kids to go through that, to picket a building, for example, and people upstairs in the building are spitting down on your head or trying to vomit down on you. This is a tremendous amount to demand of people who are technically free in a free country which is supposed to be the leader of the West. It seems to me a great cowardice in the part of the Republic to expect that it's going to be saved by a handful of children for whom they refuse to be responsible.
And so it is so much more difficult then, or so much more easy, I should say, for a black Muslim speaker to win followers than for Martin Luther King, who was asking
It is
so
always
much.
much easier, obviously, to how can I put this, well, in Harlem, those meetings every Saturday night, those people there listening to those speeches and all kinds of other speeches, because they are in despair, and they don't believe, and this is the most dangerous thing that has happened. They don't believe they've been betrayed so often and by so many people, not all of them white. They don't believe that the country really means what it says, and there is nothing in the record to indicate the country means what it says. Now, when they are told that they are better than white people, it is a perfectly inevitable development. If, for all these hundreds of years, white people are going around saying they're better than anybody else, sooner or later, they were bound to create a counterweight to this, especially with Africa on the stage of the world now, which is simply to take the whole legend of Western history and its whole entire theology, changing one or two pronouns, and transferring from Jerusalem to Islam, and this is just this small change and turn it all against the white world. And the white world can't do anything about this, can't call the Muslim leaders or anybody else on this until they're willing to face their own history.
How does all this then connect with a Negro artist, a Negro writer, specifically you, coming out and to a man who meant so much to you, Richard Wright? There's, in one of the, again, we come back to Wright's chapter, he escaped. He spoke of Paris as a refuge, but you looked upon it as a sort of way station for yourself.
Well, in the beginning, I must admit, I looked on Paris as a refuge, too. I never intended to come back to this country. I lived there so long, though, and I got to know a great deal about Paris. And I suppose that several things happened to me. One of them was watching American Negroes there who had dragged Mississippi, to, so to speak, across the ocean with them and were operating now in a vacuum. I myself, carried all my social habits to Paris with me, where they were not needed, but where it took me a long time to learn how to do without them. And this complex frightened me very much. But more important than that, perhaps, was my relationship with Africans and with Algerians there, who belonged to France and didn't demand a spectacular degree of perception to realize that I was treated, insofar as I was noticed at all, differently from them because I had an American passport. I may not have liked this fact, but it was a fact. And I could see very well that if I were an Algerian, I would not have been living in the same city in which I imagined myself to be living as Jimmy Baldwin, or if I were an African, it would have been a very different city for me. And I also began to see that the West, the entire West, was changing, was breaking up, that its power over me, over Africans, was gone and would never come again. So then it seemed that exile was but another way of being in limbo. But I suppose finally the most important thing was that I am a writer, and that sounds grandiloquent, but the truth is that I don't think that, seriously speaking, really, that anybody in his right mind would want to be a writer. But you do discover that you are one, and then you haven't got any choice. Either you live that life or you won't live any. And I'm an American writer. This country is my subject. And in working out the forthcoming novel, I began to realize that the New York I was trying to describe was a New York which was by this time nearly 20 years old. I had to come back to check my impressions and to, as it turned out, be stung again, to look at it again, bear it again, and to be reconciled to it again. Now, I imagine, in my own case, that I will have to spend the rest of my life, however long that will be, as a kind of transatlantic commuter. Because at some point when I'm in this country, I always get to a place where I realize that I don't see it very clearly anymore, because it's very exhausting to spend, after all, and you do spend 24 hours a day resisting and resenting it, and trying to keep a kind of equilibrium in it. So that I suppose that I'll keep going away and coming back,
You feel your years in Europe afforded you more of a perspective?
Yeah, I began to see this country for the first time. If I hadn't gone away, I would never been able to see it, and if I had been able to see it, I would never been able to forgive it. I'm not mad at this country anymore. I'm very worried about it. And I'm not worried about the Negroes in the country even so much as I'm worried about the country. The country doesn't know. The country doesn't know what it's done to Negroes, but the country has no notion whatever, and this is disastrous, of what it's done to itself. They have yet to assess the price they paid, North and South, for keeping the Negro in his place. And from my point of view, it shows on every single level of our lives, from the most public.
Could you expand on this a bit, Jim, what the country has done to itself?
Well, one of the reasons, for example, I think that our youth is so badly educated, and it is inconceivably badly educated, is because education demands a certain daring, a certain independence of mind. You have to teach young people to think. And you have to teach young people, in order to teach young people to think, you have to teach them to think about everything. There mustn't be something they cannot think about. If there's one thing they can't think about, then very surely they can't think about anything. Now, there's always something in this country, of course, one cannot think about. One cannot think about as a Negro. Now, this may seem like a very subtle argument, but I don't think so. I think that really time will prove the connection between the level, the lives we lead, and this extraordinary endeavor to avoid black men. And I think it shows in our public life. I think that when I was living in Europe, it occurred to me that what Americans in Europe did not know about Europeans was precisely what they didn't know about me. And what Americans today don't know about the rest of the world, like Cuba or Africa, is what they don't know about me. And the totally incoherent foreign policy of this country is a reflection of the incoherence of the private lives here.
So we don't even know our own names.
No, we don't. That's the whole point. I suggest this, that in order to learn your name, you're going to have to learn mine. In a way, the key to this country, the American Negro, is the key figure in this country. And if we don't face him, we will never face anything.
Since you've mentioned, I don't know your name, I, a white man, will never know mine. Thinking now as a country, when you know the country, we think of Africa immediately. You were covering a meeting of Negro writers of the world in Paris.
Yeah.
And African writers were speaking too,
Yeah.
as well as writers of...
It was really an African conference, predominantly African. The Negroes were there as Africans, or as, well, the black people of the world, let's put it that way.
What of the African writer then? You mentioned Tituola here, and isn't there a problem here? The uncovering of this rich heritage so long buried by kidnappers, by colonial people, and at the same time we know that technological advances are taking place, changes, slums are being cleared.
20th century, in fact.
20th century. Now, isn't there loss as well as gain here? It's a question of two things happening at the same time.
It's a very great question. I don't know what... it's almost impossible to assess what was lost, which makes it impossible to assess what's gained. How can I put this? Yeah, in a way, I almost envy African writers because there's so much to excavate, and because their relationship to the world, at least from my vantage point, though by this I may be wrong, seems much more direct than mine can ever be. But God knows, the colonial experience destroyed so much, blasted so much, and of course changed forever the African personality. So one doesn't know what really was there on the other side of the flood. It'll take generations before that past can be reestablished and in effect used. And at the same time, of course, all the African nations have are under the obligation, the necessity of moving into the 20th century at really, some fantastic rate of speed, because it's the only way they can survive. And of course, all Africans, whether they know it or not, have endured the European experience and have been stained and changed by the European standards. In a curious way, the unification of Africa, insofar as it can be said to exist, is a white invention. That is to say, the only thing that really unites, as far as I can tell, all black men everywhere is the fact that white men are on their necks. What I'm curious about is what will happen when this is no longer true, and for the first time in the memory of anybody living, black men have their destinies in their own hands. What will come out then, and what the problems and tensions and terrors will be then, is a very great, very loaded question. I think that if we were more honest here, we could do a great deal to aid in this transition, because we have an advantage, which we still consider to be a disadvantage, over all the other Western nations. That is to say, we have created, forgetting, quite apart from everything else, the fact is we have created, and no other nation has, a black man who is part of the West. Now, and in distinction to Belgium or any other European power, we had our slaves on the mainland, and therefore, no matter how we deny it, couldn't avoid a human involvement with them, which we've almost perished denying, but which is nevertheless there. Now, if we could turn about and face this, we would have a tremendous advantage in the world today. But as long as we don't, there isn't much hope for the West, really. How can I put this? If one could accept the fact that it is no longer important to be white, it would begin to cease to be important to be black. If we could accept the fact that no nation with 20 million people, 20 million black people in it, for so long, and with such a depth of involvement, no nation in these circumstances can really be called a white nation. This would be a great achievement, and it would change a great many things.
This raises a very interesting point. This is all conjecture, of course, assuming that sanity is maintained, assuming that humanity itself, the humanity in all of us, will triumph. A point is just you say this, there will be no white nation and no black nation, but the nations of people. Now we come to a question of this long-buried heritage. At the beginning, a Bessie Smith record was played. You, once upon a time, not knowing who you were ashamed of it. Now
yes,
realize there's a great pride here in artistry.
Yeah.
Thinking now of the young African. Again, if a certain identity, and this is an imposed identity from the outside, is lost, will he reject that which was uniquely his for a grayness, perhaps, even though it be more materially advanced?
I have a tendency to doubt it, but then, of course, there's no way of knowing. I have a tendency, judging only from my very limited experience in Paris with a few Africans, after all, my tendency is to doubt it. I think that the real impulse is to excavate that heritage, at no matter what cost, and bring it into the present. And I think that this is a very sound idea, because I think it's needed. I think that all the things that were destroyed by Europe, which will never really be put in place again, still in that rubble, I think there's something of very great value, not only for Africans, but for all of us. I really think that we are living in a moment which is as important as that moment when Constantine became a Christian. I think that all the standards by which the Western world has lived so long are in the process of breakdown and a revision, and a kind of passion and a kind of beauty and a kind of joy which was in the world before and has been buried so long has got to come back.
The impersonality of our time.
Yes.
A matter of dehumanization.
Yes. And obviously this cannot, well, I would hate to see it continue. I don't ever intend to make my peace with such a world. There's something much more important than Cadillacs, Frigidaires, and IBM machines. And precisely one of the things wrong with this country is this notion that IBM machines and Cadillacs prove something. People are always telling me how many Negroes bought Cadillacs last year. And it terrifies me. I always wonder, is this what you think the country is for? And do you think this is really what I came here and suffered and died for? A lousy Cadillac?
Whether for white or black, is this what our country is for?
For white or black, yes, exactly. I think the country's got to find out what it means by freedom. Freedom is a very dangerous thing. Anything else is disastrous. But freedom is dangerous. You've got to make choices. You've got to make very dangerous choices. You've got to be taught that, your life is in your hands.
The matter of freedom, this leads to another chapter in your book dealing with your meeting with Ingmar Bergman, whom you described as a relatively free artist.
Yeah.
Would you mind telling us a bit about that, what you meant by that?
Well, part of his freedom, of course, is just purely economical. It's based on the social structure, the economic structure of Sweden. That is to say, he hasn't got to worry about the money for his films, which is a very healthy thing for him. But on another level, he impressed me as being free because he had, and this is a great paradox, seems to me, about freedom. He had accepted his limitations, the limitations within himself and the limitations within his society. I don't mean that he necessarily accepted all these limitations. I mean that he was passive in the face of them. But he recognized that he was Ingmar Bergman, who could do some things, therefore could not do some others. It was not going to live forever, Had recognized what people in this country have a great deal of trouble recognizing, that life is very difficult for anybody born. Now, I don't think people can be free until they recognize this. In the same way, Bessie Smith was much freer, all as terrible as this may sound, much freer than the people who murdered her or let her die, And Big Bill Broomsey, a much freer man than these success-ridden people running around on Madison Avenue today. If you can accept the worst, as someone said to me, then you can see the best. But if you think life is a great big glorious plum pudding, you'll end up in the madhouse.
To perhaps even extend the examples you just offered, the little girl who walked into the Little Rock schoolhouse
Yes.
or the Charlotte, North Carolina, and was spat on was much freer
Yes,
than the
people spat on
white
her.
child who sat there with
Yes.
a misconceived notion.
Well, I think the proof that Negroes are much stronger in the South today is simply,
She knew who she was.
she knew who she was. She knew who she was. And after all, that child has been coming for a very long time. She didn't come out of nothing. And the Negro families are able to produce such children, And whereas the good white people of the South have yet to make any appearance, proves something awful about the moral state of the South. Those people in Tallahassee who were never in the streets when the mobs are there, well, why aren't they? It's their town too.
What about someone like Lillian Smith?
Lillian Smith is a great, I think a very great and heroic and very lonely figure, obviously, She has very few friends in that little hamlet in Georgia where she carries on so gallantly. She's paid a tremendous price for trying to do what she thinks is right. And the price is terribly, terribly high. The only way for the price to become a little less is for more people to do it.
Because here is someone of the South, a minority of one, and perhaps a few prototypes here and there, but the majority is not necessarily right all the
The
time.
majority is usually, I hate to say this, wrong. I think there's a great confusion in this country anyway about that, I don't.
Gibson's enemy of the people.
Yes. I really think seriously. There's a division of labor in the world, and some people are here to. I can see. Well, let me put it this way. There's so many things I'm not good at. I can't drive a truck. I couldn't run a bank. Well, all right. So that other people have to do that. Well, in a way, they're responsible to me, and I'm responsible to them. And my responsibility to them is to try to tell the truth as I see it. Not so much about my private life, it's about their private lives. So that there is in the world a standard, for all of us, which will get you through your trouble, because your trouble's always coming. And your Cadillacs don't get you through it. And neither do psychiatrists, incidentally, All to get you through it really is some faith in life, which is not so easy to achieve. Now, when we talk about majorities and minorities, I always have the feeling that this country is talking about a kind of popularity contest, in which everybody works together towards some absolutely hideously material end. But in truth, I think that, politicians, for example, in the South, where, it's shown most clearly, I think all the Southern politicians have failed their responsibility to the white people of the South. Somebody in the South must know that obviously the situation, the status quo will not exist another 100 years. And their real responsibility is to prepare the people who are now forming those mobs, prepare those people for that day, to minimize the damage to them, even. Now, the majority rule in the South is not a majority rule at all. It's a mob rule. And what these mobs fill is a moral vacuum, which is created by the lack of a leader. And it seems to me this is the way the world is. And I'm not talking about dictatorships. I mean that...
Statesmen.
Statesmen, and people who are sitting in government are supposed to know more about government than people who are driving trucks and digging potatoes and trying to raise their children. That's what you're in the office for.
Someone then with a sense of history, perhaps.
Yes, which is precisely what we don't have here.
Sense of history.
Yes, if you don't know what happened behind you, you have no idea what's happening around you. And that's a law.
Earlier, Jim, you mentioned that for a national policy to be straightened out, the private policies, the private lives, individual
That's right.
lives must be. And you spoke, too, of your job as a writer. you've got to write. And in this chapter with Bergman, the Northern Protestant, there's a beautiful comment here. All art is a kind of confession, more or less oblique. All artists, if they're to survive, are forced at last to tell the whole story, to vomit the anguish up. All of it, the literal offensive when you speak of Bergman, but all art is a kind of confession, as you apparently do in all your writings.
I think it has to be a kind of confession. I don't mean a true confession in the sense of that dreary magazine. But I mean, the effort, it seems to me, is to, if you can examine and face your life, you can discover the terms in which you're connected to other lives. And they can discover, too, the terms in which they're connected to other people. It's happened to every one of us, I'm sure. You know, that one has read something which you thought only happened to you, and you discover that it happened 100 years ago to Dostoevsky. And this is a very great liberation, you know, for the suffering, struggling person who always thinks that he's alone. This is why it's important. It is not important, you know, for any... I don't think that art would not be important if life were not more important. And life is important. And life is mainly, you know, most of us, no matter what we say, are walking in the dark, whistling in the dark. Nobody knows what's going to happen to him one moment to the next, or how he will bear it. You know, and this is irreducible, and it's true for everybody. Now, it is true that the nature of society has to be to create among its citizens an illusion of safety. But it's also absolutely true that the safety is always necessarily an illusion, and artists are here to disturb the peace. They have to disturb the peace. Otherwise, chaos.
Life, and life is risk.
It is indeed. It is. It always is. It always is. And people have to know this. Some way they have to know it in order to get through their risks.
So the safety itself is wholly illusory.
Yes,
Safety.
there's no such a thing as safety on this planet. No one knows that much. No one ever will. Not alone about the world, but about himself. That's why it's, you know, of course it's unsafe. And people in some way have to know this. And this is what the whole sense of tragedy is really all about. And people think, I think that a sense of tragedy is a kind of embroidery or something irrelevant which you can take or leave. But in fact, it's a necessity. That's what the blues are all about. It's what the spirituals are about. It is the ability to look on things as they are and survive your losses, or even not survive them, but to know that they're coming. You know, because to know they're coming is only possible insurance you have, some faint insurance, that you will survive them.
You spoke of sense of tragedy. Again, in your book, you speak of us Americans lacking. We have tremendous potentialities. You say
Yes.
we lack that which a non-American may have, a sense of tragedy.
Yes, I think we do, and I know American, you know, it's incredible to me that, and I'm not trying to oversimplify anything, but it's incredible to me that in this country, where after all materially, for the most part, one is better off than anywhere else in the world, that one should know so many people who are in a state of the most absolute insecurity about themselves, you know, so they literally can't get through a morning without going to see the psychiatrist. And I find it very difficult to take this really seriously, since other people who have really terrifying and unimaginable troubles from the American point of view don't dream of going anywhere near a psychiatrist, and they wouldn't have the money to do it if they were mad enough to dream it. It seems to me it points to a very great, well, not illness exactly, but fear. Frenchmen that I used to know, French women, spend much less time in this dreadful internal warfare, tearing themselves and each other to pieces, than Americans do. And why this is so is probably a question for someone else, but it is so. And I think it says something very serious about the real aims and the real standards of our society. People don't live by the standards they say they live by. And the gap between their profession and the actuality is what creates this despair and this uncertainty, which is very, very dangerous.
In the last chapter, the last part of your book, Nobody Knows My Name, the black boy looks at the white boy. It's your relationship to Norman Mailer, but the very last part says, if he has understood them, he, in this instance, the white boy.
Yeah, the
white
writer.
boy,
No.
then he is richer, and we are richer too.
Mm-hmm.
If he has not understood them, we are all much poorer. For though it clearly needs to be brought into focus, he has a real vision of ourselves as we are, and it cannot be too often repeated in this country now that where there is no vision, the people perish.
Mm-hmm. I mean that.
And the hour has gone so ludicrously rapidly. James Baldwin, who has confessed in a very beautiful way Perhaps one last question, James Baldwin. Who are you now?
Who indeed? Well, I may be able to tell you quite who I am, but I think I'm discovering who I'm not. I want to be an honest man, and I want to be a good writer. And I don't know if one ever gets to be what one wants to be. You know, I think you just have to play it by ear and pray for rain.